To really understand how a sane society loses its collective mind over a flower, you first have to step onto the docks of Amsterdam in the early 1600s. This wasn't just a city, it was the financial center of the universe. The Dutch East India Company was flooding the country with spices, silks, and unthinkable amounts of gold. The merchants there had a problem we can only dream of today. They had too much cash and nothing exciting enough to spend it on, until a diplomat brought a strange turban-shaped flower back from the courts of the Ottoman Empire, the tulip. It was love at first sight. But the obsession didn't really start with the garden variety flowers you see today. The Dutch developed a taste for something much rarer. They became obsessed with broken bulbs. These were flowers infected by a mosaic virus, though they didn't know it was a sickness at the time. They just saw the result. The virus made the solid colors of the petals streak and shatter into wild, flame-like patterns of white and crimson or yellow and purple. Because this was caused by a biological accident, you couldn't just grow them on purpose. You had to get lucky. It was nature's lottery. Owning one of these rare striped tulips became the ultimate status symbol. It said to the world that you didn't just have money, you had taste, you had connections, and you had something that money technically shouldn't be able to buy. It started as a hobby for gentlemen, a way to show off in the garden. But as the 1630s rolled on, that admiration turned into a hunger that began to consume the entire country.
By the winter of 1636, this wasn't about gardening anymore. The trade moved out of the manicured estates and into the smoke-filled back rooms of local taverns. This is where the story gets truly messy. The barrier to entry collapsed. You didn't need a heavy purse of gold to start. You just needed a down payment and a lot of nerve. Weavers, bricklayers, and chimney sweeps looked at their wealthy neighbors and decided they wanted a piece of the action. They called it the wind trade, a perfect name because people were buying and selling bulbs that were currently asleep underground. No one actually held the flower. They just passed around scraps of paper promising ownership of a root that might bloom 6 months later. The prices detached from reality completely. At the absolute summit of this madness sat the Semper Augustus. This was the celebrity of the era, a flower with petals of pure white violently streaked with blood-red crimson. It was hypnotic. At the height of the frenzy, a single bulb of the Semper Augustus was valued at a price that could buy you a grand, fully furnished luxury townhouse on the most fashionable canal in Amsterdam. To give you a real sense of the scale, look at the famous trade for a slightly cheaper bulb, the Viceroy. For the cost of that one flower, a man traded away 4 fat oxen, 8 swine, 12 sheep, 2 hogsheads of wine, 4 tons of beer, 2 tons of butter, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a bed, a suit of clothes, and a silver cup. He traded an entire livelihood for a single onion that could rot in a week.
It was a high-stakes game of musical chairs, and the music was playing so loud that nobody bothered to check if there were any seats left. People were leveraging their homes, taking out loans, and liquidating life savings, all convinced that there would always be someone else willing to pay just a little bit more tomorrow. But markets run on confidence, and confidence is a fragile thing. On a chilly Tuesday in February 1637, the music finally stopped. It happened in the city of Haarlem. It was a routine auction, the kind that had been happening every day for months. The auctioneer called out a price for a bag of bulbs. Silence. He lowered the price. Still silence. A whisper of doubt rippled through the tavern. That whisper turned into a murmur, and the murmur turned into a panic. In a single heartbeat, the spell was broken. Everyone in the room realized at the exact same moment that they weren't holding gold or diamonds. They were holding onions. The crash was absolute. Within days, bulbs that were worth the price of a mansion were selling for the price of a common vegetable. The wealth evaporated because it never really existed in the first place. It was all paper promises and hype. Merchants who had gone to sleep as millionaires woke up destitute. The Dutch courts were clogged for years with lawsuits, neighbors suing neighbors over debts that could never be repaid. It remains the ultimate cautionary tale. We look back and laugh at them for trading fortunes for flowers, but deep down, we know we aren't that different. It shows us that when greed and the fear of missing out mix together, human beings will convince themselves of anything. The tulip didn't change. We did. What is truly surprising about the aftermath is that the Dutch Republic didn't actually fall apart. You would expect a financial crash of that magnitude to bankrupt the nation, but the Netherlands was so incredibly wealthy, so dominant in global trade, that the country simply shook it off and kept moving. The real tragedy was entirely personal. It was the individual shoemaker who lost his shop, the widow who gambled away her inheritance, or the ambitious weaver who ended up back at his loom with nothing but debt. But there is a bitter, poetic irony regarding the flowers themselves. Remember that virus? The sickness that created those beautiful, flame-like streaks which drove everyone mad? It was fatal. The virus weakened the bulbs generation after generation, making them smaller and frailer until they couldn't reproduce at all. The legendary Semper Augustus, that specific flower worth the price of a mansion, eventually went extinct. It was bred out of existence by its own beauty. You cannot buy one today for any amount of money. The object of all that desire simply withered away and vanished from the earth. We tell this story often as a warning about human stupidity, but perhaps we are being too hard on them. This was the first time in history a financial bubble had ever occurred. They didn't have history books to warn them about market corrections or speculation bubbles. They were the pioneers of greed. And if you look at the world today, at the housing crises, the tech bubbles, or the wild swings of cryptocurrency, you realize the spirit of the tulip trade never really left us. We are still chasing that next big thing, holding our breath, hoping to get rich before the music stops.
Today, you can walk through the floating flower market in Amsterdam and buy a bag of tulip bulbs for a few euros. They are cheap, common, and available to everyone. But if you hold one in your hand and look closely at the deep, saturated colors, you can still feel a faint echo of the spell that once brought an empire to its knees. It turns out, the true value of a flower was never in what you could sell it for, but simply in the miracle that it blooms at all.
There is one particular anecdote from the height of the craze that is too good not to share, because it perfectly illustrates the absurdity of the era. As the story goes, a wealthy merchant had just purchased a rare bulb, perhaps a Semper Augustus or something close to it, and left it sitting on his counting house counter. A sailor, who had just docked from a long voyage, came in to deliver news. He saw what looked like a stray onion lying there. Thinking it would go nicely with the red herring he had for lunch, he slipped it into his pocket. He sat on a coil of rope outside, peeled the layers, and ate it. When the merchant returned and realized his investment was missing, he rushed out to find the sailor picking his teeth. The man had just casually devoured a breakfast that cost more than the entire ship he had sailed in on. The sailor was thrown in jail for eating a fortune, but in his defense, he claimed it tasted dry and oily. It highlights the central joke of the whole crisis. To the sailor, it was just a calorie. To the merchant, it was a mansion. Value is entirely in the eye of the beholder. But while the bulbs rotted and the fortunes vanished, something beautiful did survive. Because the flowers bloomed for such a short time, the wealthy owners hired master painters to create what were known as tulip books. These were catalogs of exquisite watercolor paintings capturing the intricate streaks of the infected flowers. Today, those paintings are the only reason we know what a Semper Augustus actually looked like. The irony is sharp. The investors ignored the art to chase the flower, but in the end, the flower went extinct, the money disappeared, and the art is the only thing that held its value across the centuries. You might expect that after such a humiliating public disaster, the Dutch people would want nothing to do with the tulip ever again. You would think they would look at those colorful petals and feel shame or anger or regret. But the most fascinating part of this history is not the crash. It is the resilience that followed. The Dutch didn't banish the flower, they democratized it. They took the object of their greatest folly and turned it into their national identity. Instead of chasing the rare, sick bulbs that destroyed fortunes, they focused on the healthy ones. They turned the cultivation of tulips into a steady, reliable science rather than a gambler's paradise. Today, if you fly over the Netherlands in the springtime, you don't see the ruins of a financial collapse. You see vast, geometric stripes of brilliant colors stretching to the horizon. It is an industrial machine of beauty. The mania died, but the love for the flower survived. There is a profound lesson in that transition. We often tell the story of Tulip Mania as a warning about greed, and it certainly is that. But it is also a story about value. In 1637, the value was an illusion created by desperate people in backroom taverns. Today, the value is real. It is in the millions of tourists who travel to Keukenhof just to stare at a garden, and in the billions of bulbs exported around the globe to brighten up a dreary winter window.
So the next time you buy a cheap bouquet of tulips from a grocery store for a few dollars, take a second to really look at them. You are holding the ghost of a 17th century fortune. You are holding the thing that once made the richest people in the world lose their minds. And in a way, you are the winner of history because you get to enjoy the beauty without having to sell your house to pay for it. There is a final twist to this story that often gets lost in the excitement of the crash. We tend to picture the entire population of the Netherlands, from the richest aristocrat to the poorest orphan, running around waving fistfuls of money at flowers. We imagine a total societal collapse. But modern historians have dug into the archives and found something quite interesting. The mania might not have been as widespread as the legends say. It turns out that a lot of the stories we repeat today, like the chimney sweeps becoming millionaires, were actually written by people who hated the trade. In the years after the crash, strict Calvinist moralists and satirists published pamphlets mocking the speculators. They wanted to paint the tulip traders as sinful, gambling fools to teach the public a lesson about greed and vanity. They exaggerated the scale of the madness to make sure the moral stuck. So, in a way, Tulip Mania is half history and half fable. It was a real financial bubble, yes, but it was also a ghost story invented by a society that was terrified of its own wealth. This connects perfectly to a concept the Dutch painters of the time were obsessed with, vanitas. If you look at still life paintings from the Golden Age, you see skulls, hourglasses with the sand running out, and almost always a wilting flower. The tulip became the ultimate symbol of memento mori, remember that you must die. It was a physical reminder that beauty is temporary and that wealth can wither just as fast as a petal in the sun.
The Dutch didn't just suffer through the crash, they internalized it. They used the flower to remind themselves that the Golden Age couldn't last forever, and they were right. The era of unprecedented dominance eventually faded, just like the Semper Augustus. But unlike the money, which vanished into thin air, the lesson remained. It is a reminder that when we try to pin our happiness on something as fragile as a trend, or a stock, or a flower, we are building castles on shifting sand. The tulip is beautiful, but it was never meant to hold the weight of a nation's soul. It is fascinating to realize that those smoky taverns in the 1630s were effectively the birthplace of the modern stock market. Before the tulips, buying something usually meant you handed over coins and walked away with a cow or a bag of grain. But the Dutch invented the futures market. They were buying the right to own a tulip 6 months down the line. This financial innovation is exactly what runs the global economy today. Every time you hear about oil prices or grain futures on the news, you are hearing a direct echo of the wind trade. They invented the complex financial tools we use today. They just happened to test them out on a delicate flower first. And there is one final mystery that the merchants of the 17th century went to their graves without ever understanding. They spent fortunes on those broken bulbs, believing the flame-like patterns were a gift from God or a miracle of nature. It wasn't until the 1920s, nearly 300 years later, that scientists finally discovered the truth. It was an aphid. A tiny, insignificant insect was spreading a specific potty-virus between the plants. The most expensive object in the world was created by a bug. The vivid colors that ruined so many lives were just the symptoms of a dying plant fighting an infection. If those merchants had known they were bankrupting themselves for a plant disease, history might have looked very different. But maybe not, because in the end, logic rarely stands a chance against beauty. The story of the tulip is the story of us. It is a mirror that shows us our creativity, our capacity for wonder, and our absolute, reckless willingness to believe in a fantasy if it looks pretty enough. We stopped trading houses for bulbs a long time ago. But the part of the human brain that wants to believe the price will go up forever is still very much alive.
When we strip away the economics and the history books, the story of the tulip leaves us with a slightly uncomfortable realization about how the world works. It forces us to admit that value is nothing more than a shared story we tell each other. A diamond is just a shiny rock until we agree it is precious. A $100 bill is just a piece of cotton blend paper until we agree it has power. For a few years in the 17th century, the smartest people in the richest country on earth agreed that a flower was worth a house. As long as they all agreed, it was true. The moment they stopped agreeing, it became a lie. That is the terrifying part. It reveals that the line between a boom and a bust is often entirely imaginary. We like to believe that markets are driven by math and logic, but the tulip proves that they are actually driven by mood. They are driven by the fear of missing out and the fear of being left holding the bag. The wealth wasn't destroyed by a war or a plague. It was destroyed because people simply changed their minds.
So, 400 years later, the tulip stands as a silent monument to human irrationality. It is the prettiest warning sign in history. It reminds us that we are not nearly as logical as we pretend to be. We are emotional, we are mimetic, and we are prone to madness. The flower itself was never the problem. The tulip was just doing what nature designed it to do: bloom, look beautiful, and fade away. It was us who projected our greed onto its petals. And if we aren't careful, we will find a new flower, a new stock, or a new digital token, and we will do it all over again. If you stand on the banks of the Herengracht Canal in Amsterdam this evening, the water is calm. The grand brick houses, some of which were built with the profits of the Golden Age, are still standing there, glowing in the sunset. It is incredibly peaceful. It is almost impossible to imagine that these very cobblestones were once the scene of the world's first collective nervous breakdown. But the true ending of this story isn't the crash. It is what stuck around after the noise died down. The Dutch did something remarkable. They didn't destroy the thing that hurt them. They tamed it. They took the wildest, most volatile gamble in history and turned it into an industry of precision and order. Today, the tulip isn't a symbol of insanity, it is a symbol of the Netherlands itself, reliable, cheerful, and grounded. The flower that once wrecked the economy is now one of the main pillars supporting it. There is a quiet victory in that. The speculators are long dead. The gold coins have been spent or lost. The panic is just a footnote in a history book. But the flowers are still here. They come back every single spring, pushing up through the cold earth, totally indifferent to the price tag we put on them. In the end, nature played the long game. We tried to own beauty, we tried to financialize it, and we failed. But the beauty survived us anyway. No matter how crazy the world gets, or how hard the markets crash, the spring will always return, and the bloom will always open.